Hi again, YouTube. This episode is going to be a little bit different, maybe a little bit of a surprise. It's actually a Commodore 64 game, and while many kids grew up playing NES, and I played a lot of NES growing up, my main source of video game entertainment was Commodore 64. On top of that, I was, and still am, a bit of a history buff, specifically Cold War history, and today's game not only has the Cold War as the subject matter, but it also is part of the Cold War, a part of Cold War history, and not a lot of games can claim that. So, let's take a look at Raid Over Moscow. Raid Over Moscow was released in 1984 for the Commodore 64, and then Apple II, Atari 8-bit, and several other computer home systems over the next 2 years. It was developed by Access Software and published by US Gold. The backstory was surprisingly well thought out for a game of that era. It also paints the attitudes and fears of that time very well. In the quote-unquote near future, the US and Europe have proposed the SALT IV Treaty, which forces the US and Soviet Union to dismantle all of their nuclear weapons. The US has complied with this treaty and has dismantled its entire nuclear arsenal, and is planning on replacing those weapons with a defense network of 12 laser-firing satellites and 12 space stations equipped with stealth aircraft. When the game begins, the US has one of these space stations fully manned and operational, with the rest under construction. You are the commander of that space station. Meanwhile, the Soviets have fallen far behind the US in installing a new defense system. Though they've complied with the treaty as well, they have refused to be placed in a position of vulnerability and have secretly hidden nuclear weapons within 3 of their major cities. This is where a coup occurs in Saudi Arabia, which has left the region extremely unstable. The Soviets then send troops there to ensure the instatement of a pro-Soviet government. As the US sends troops in to help the Saudis, the Soviets launch a nuclear strike against the US and issue an ultimatum. If the US does not pull its forces out of the Persian Gulf immediately, the Soviet Union will be forced to detonate the missiles on impact. You as commander must lead your commandos on a suicide mission to take out the launch sites and control systems, then proceed into Moscow and lead a counterstrike on the Soviet Defense Center. In other words, save the world. Raid Over Moscow was basically made by one man, Bruce Carver, who says that the name for the game sprang up while he was on a trip from Las Vegas to his home in Utah. He went on to become a legend in the PC gaming world. Bruce Carver was the co-founder of Access Software along with his brother Roger Carver and colleague Chris Jones. Access would become well known for some great titles on the Commodore 64, like Beachhead 1 and 2 and Raid Over Moscow, and then the highly successful and influential Lynx series of golf video games, which spanned across the Commodore 64, DOS, and Windows, and defined the golf game and sports simulation genre. They were also known for the Tex Murphy series of post-apocalyptic adventure games. Those featured full-motion videos with Chris Jones playing Tex Murphy himself. In the end, it was the same story that so many small development companies end up being part of. They were bought out by Microsoft in 1999 and renamed to Salt Lake Game Studio, and then in 2003 they were renamed once more to Indie Games. In 2004 the studio was sold to Take-Two Interactive and renamed once more to Indie Built, and shut down in 2006 without any public statement from Take-Two as to why. Happily, Chris Jones started the development studio Big Finish Games in 2007, and many alumni from Access Software still work there to this day and release story-driven interactive games including Tex Murphy. As for Bruce himself, he went on to be labeled a gaming god by PC Gamer magazine in 1997. By all accounts, Bruce truly loved what he did. He believed that a programmer had to be an artist in addition to being just a raw programmer, and truly understood the game development process on a deep level. He liked to take the user to the edge with his games, to the point where his or her hands started to be sweaty and constantly having to make rapid-fire decisions. Former colleagues of his have referred to him as a bit erratic at points, a shrewd negotiator, and could be extremely polarizing, but he was also known as a remarkable motivator, creative genius, and inventive game designer. In 1999, when Access was sold to Microsoft, Several people were let go, and Carver paid generous golden parachutes to several of these people out of his own pockets. In 2003, Carver left the gaming industry after 2 legendary decades. Putting his engineering degree to use, he started Carver Homes Construction Company while also collaborating with former Access employees to create True Golf, a golf simulator company. More than anything else, though, Bruce was known as a tireless family man, and his family was his greatest joy. In 2005, 3 days after Christmas, Bruce Carver passed away suddenly from cancer. He is survived by his wife, 6 children, and 16 grandchildren. He was 57 years old. So, you have to remember the era and the platform in which Raid Over Moscow was released. It's pretty complex and lengthy for a game made in 1984. We're talking about the pre-NES days. The gameplay in Raid Over Moscow is laid out in a mission format. The opening sequence is a world overview from Strategic Air Command. From here, you are alerted to any Soviet nuclear activity. Any active launch sites become white. At the bottom of the screen, you can see telemetry like time to impact, launch site, and target. Your space station is at the top of the screen, from which you'll be able to launch your stealth aircraft. You'll then be taken to the hangar, where you'll scramble your aircraft and exit the station. Once again, you can see telemetry at the bottom of the screen, like position, velocity, and altitude, all in real time. Also, the control of the aircraft is surprisingly simulator-like. You actually have to thrust forward, which pushes you the way you're facing, and control vertical lift with the fire button. It's like driving on ice, which can make it challenging to actually exit the hangar. This is 1984 we're talking about, guys. This is an era where just this hangar sequence was enough to qualify as a full-fledged arcade game. But I digress. Once you've exited the hangar, you can make your way down to the launch site, either Saratov, Minsk, or Leningrad. You can actually return to the hangar with the spacebar and repeat the process, allowing you to essentially bring multiple planes on the mission. This means if you die, you don't have to go back and get another plane. All 3 of these levels are identical. You fly along in your attack run, blowing up buildings, tanks, and helicopters, avoiding obstacles and missiles, and finally destroying the launch silo, in a sort of mini-boss type battle. After these 3 launch sites are destroyed, you'll move in on Moscow, where you'll destroy the Soviet Defense Center, which happens to be modeled on the very real State Historical Museum in Moscow. The Defense Center has a row of green doors at the bottom. When hit, they turn red. One of them turns white. This is randomized and will be different every playthrough. This white door represents the entrance to the reactor room. Other targets that must be attacked are towers, soldiers, and the tank. As a kid, I loved making the towers fall on the tank. Simpler times. So, once the white door is exposed and there are no soldiers or tanks on the screen, you move in on the reactor room. Here, the reactor has a maintenance robot providing the reactor with coolant. Destroy the robot, overheat the reactor. So, as a US Commando, how do you accomplish this? Guns? Explosives? No! Bouncing disc grenades, of course. Joking aside, it seems silly, but it was actually a clever way to accomplish a straightforward task. The maintenance robot is completely invulnerable to frontal attack, so you'll actually have to bounce your grenade off the wall behind the robot, hitting it in its soft hindquarters. Also, you'll have to catch your returning disc if it misses because you only have a limited supply. This is actually not as easy as it looks. Every time you hit the robot, it becomes faster and more aggressive. Additionally, you have to destroy 2 to 5 robots depending on difficulty. The amount of men you have for this scenario is determined by how well you've done in the game up to that point. If you run out of discs, you lose a man, at which point you'll have to go back to the defense center scenario and try again. When you fight the final robot, the ETCM timer, or estimated time to critical mass, will start to count down. Whether you escape alive or not will be determined at this point. If you destroy the robot with enough time to get to your plane, you will survive. If not, well, at least you'll go down a hero. That's right, folks. Multiple endings in a game from 1984. Graphics were above average for the time. It took full advantage of the Commodore 64's powerful hardware. Animation is surprisingly fluid, namely the turning of the stealth fighter and the animation of your pilot and commando. Audio is also very good, which is not surprising because the Commodore is well known for having powerful audio hardware. Of course, there was no music to speak of, which was kind of the style at the time. The controls. That's the crux of the matter. This game is very easy on an emulator, but on a 30-plus-year-old joystick, it's not so simple to make the finer movements needed to, say, exit the hangar or aim your bazooka. The controls as they are fine. There was a one-button joystick and only a few keys on the keyboard are ever used. I recommend experiencing the game raw without an emulator if possible.
The reception to Raid Over Moscow was pretty warm, but it was not without controversy.
All the way into 1987, Raid was the second best-selling Commodore game behind Beachhead. Both graphics and audio were often praised. The theme of nuclear war was sometimes brought into question, though. At the time, the threat of nuclear war was very real and a very scary thing. This actually created moral panic in Finland. The Finnish broadcast company presented the game on its television program A-Studio in February 1985 after it was reviewed by the computer magazine Mikrobiti. A week later, leftist magazine Tiedonantaja decried the review as anti-USSR and called for a ban on all similar games. In the following days, there was much public discussion between Finnish Foreign Ministry and representatives from the Soviet Union. Shortly after, Finland received an unofficial petition from the USSR asking to ban various books and other media, including Raid Over Moscow, because they allegedly purported a distorted view of the Soviet Union. Finland's response to the petition was friendly and apologetic towards the Soviet Union, but did not ban any media. The Soviets settled on this response. As a result of this public debate, Raid Over Moscow ended up being the top-selling Commodore 64 game in Finland for most of 1985. The full extent of this debacle wasn't fully known to the world until 2010, when the Finnish Foreign Ministry memos were declassified.
Raid Over Moscow is well known in the Commodore 64 community, and it's considered one of the top titles on that platform.
In 2008, a remake was made called YF-23 Raid Over Moscow Remake. It's not a great game, but it says a lot about the fanbase and the game itself that someone would go as far as to develop a remake. If you were to play Raid Over Moscow today for the very first time, you might get perhaps an hour of gameplay out of it, one or two more on harder difficulties, and maybe an additional hour if you're playing on an actual Commodore 64. The game is pretty rare today if you can find it. It goes for maybe $25, but you likely will not get the box or the manual with it. This is the definition of a collector's item. Only collectors or gamers who grew up with the game will get any real enjoyment out of it. If you're neither of those things, you might get a neat little peek into gaming from a very different era on a very different platform. You just have to ask yourself if that's worth $25 to you. Gameplay is completely solid. No part of this game is unfun. It provides a lot of content for a game from 1984, but it is a bit easy. Graphics are also solid. I like the planetscape on the strategic screen a lot, and the animations are surprisingly smooth. Like most Commodore 64 games, the audio is great. They were also able to emulate the sounds of turbines and explosions much better than even the NES could years later. Raid Over Moscow has that eerie and pending doom feel to it. I also love the fact that they gave the game a complex backstory, which they totally didn't have to do. This game is unique in structure and doesn't do anything technically wrong, but it is 31 years old. The content isn't timeless and the gameplay is very simple. Without the nostalgia, the fascination with the subject matter, or the itch to complete your Commodore 64 library, there's very little reason to get the game today other than just sheer curiosity. In the end, I give Raid Over Moscow for the Commodore 64 7 out of 10.
That's it, guys. Thanks for watching. I do want to give a shout out to Filfer.net and AtariPodcast.com. Now, Filfer.net is an interesting blog that follows the kind of ongoing history of computer video game entertainment. And AtariPodcast.com is a great podcast if you are into retro computing in any capacity. We're talking Atari 8-bit, Commodore 64, you name it. So go check them out if you're interested. And if you like what you saw here today, please hit like, please hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.